It's my pleasure to welcome you to North Central Technical College and the 2014 Healthy Marathon County Legislative Forum. My name is Brad Gast. I'm president of Healthy Marathon County. We are a group dedicated to the health and wellness of Marathon County residents, and our goal is really to be #1 in the state in terms of health and wellness right here in Marathon County. Now, we are very excited this evening to have the opportunity to have a nice discussion about critical health issues that are affecting our area. While there's been progress and many successes to report in improving overall health in our area, we still face significant challenges. According to the Life Report conducted here in Marathon County in 2013, 38% of our residents are considered to be obese, and another 29% are considered to be overweight. This accounts for nearly 2 out of 3 residents in this county. Furthermore, alcohol and tobacco use continue to be some of the top concerns. 82% of Life survey respondents are somewhat or very concerned about drinking and alcohol use in our communities. And while tobacco use is down overall, every day in the state of Wisconsin, 13 kids begin smoking and 19 people die because of smoking. Outside of these statistical reminders, the battle for a healthy life is a challenge for everyone and every family. We face this battle together. My father died of coronary heart disease at the age of 49, leaving behind a spouse, 2 children, and a grandchild. I've witnessed firsthand the devastating effect of alcohol use on families. And I've seen how a life of smoking slowly took away a grandfather with lung cancer. Unfortunately, my story is not unique. Every one of us either has a family member or knows someone with similar stories. We are all facing the same battles. So tonight is about having conversations to change these stories, to create positive, lasting, and healthy change, to work together towards sustainable long-term solutions. We're looking at a future in which life expectancy of our children is less than their parents. This is the first time this has ever happened in modern history. Our children and grandchildren watch us tonight with great interest as they are counting on us for an opportunity to live healthier, longer, and more prosperous lives. We are honored and privileged tonight to have 6 legislative candidates here with us to share their thoughts and perspectives on the topics of obesity, alcohol, and tobacco use. We look forward to an evening of great discussion and conversation focused on solutions to meeting these major issues. I would like to thank the candidates for your time, our board for the vision, the amazing planning team who put everything together tonight, and all of our guests for being present at this forum. I would now like to introduce the moderator of tonight's forum, Eric Giordano.
Thank you, Brad. And we'd like to, again, thank the candidates for being here, and we want to introduce them quickly. And then we also want to introduce our questioner panel, who are all representing Healthy Marathon County tonight. So we'll start with our candidates. From your right to left, we have Bob Culp, Republican, representing the 69th Assembly District. Mandy Wright, I want to make sure I've got the right order. Okay, we have Mandy Wright, Democrat, representing the 85th Assembly District. Nancy Stencil, Democrat, running for the 86th Assembly. We have Richard Pulcher, a Democrat, running for the 87th Assembly seat. And finally, Paul DeMaine, a Democrat, who's running for the 29th Senate seat. So we'd like to thank them so much for being here. We'd also like to now introduce our questioners, who are all representing Healthy Marathon County. We have from my left to right, Sue Gantner. If you could just raise your hand. Joanne Janikowski and Tara Marciniak. We're so grateful that you're here tonight. So now we're going to go over just a few ground rules. We'd like you to silence your cell phones or other electronic devices. I'd like to remind you that this is an educational forum. This is not a debate. So we'd like to ask audience members to refrain from outbursts and interruptions. And we ask candidates to stick to the issues and avoid attacking your opponents or, as sometimes we like to put it, speechifying. So if you could please abide by those rules, we'd sure appreciate it. What we'll do tonight is I will read a statement on each of the 3 questions or topics that we're going to be talking about, beginning with alcohol. Then I will turn it over to the questioners, and they will each take a turn asking one question. After each question, our 5 candidates will have a minute and a half to respond, and we'll start off by having Paul Demain, and we'll just go from my right to left in answering the questions, each taking a minute and a half to do so. Then, after each question, we'll change up the order a little bit, and I'll tell you who's going first and so forth. So you'll have a minute and a half. We also have a timekeeper who's here. Ashley, thank you. And so, candidates, she will be your guide in terms of how much time you have left to answer the question. We also have passed out, hopefully nearby, some green cards. So if at any point during this conversation tonight, audience members have questions on any of those 3 topics, please limit it to either alcohol, tobacco, or obesity questions. Please do write them down and pass them to your left, and there'll be some folks, Mandy and others, who are going to collect them, and at the end of the conversation, we'll have maybe some time to ask some audience and answer some audience questions. So again, thank you all for being here, and why don't we go ahead and get started. So our first topic is on alcohol, and I'm going to read a statement. This is written by Healthy Marathon County. Excessive alcohol consumption in Wisconsin is a public health problem that affects every man, woman, and child living in the state. The estimated annual cost of excessive alcohol consumption totals over $6.8 million in lost productivity, health care, treatment, enforcement, and other costs associated with excessive alcohol use in Wisconsin. In Marathon County alone, excessive use, which includes binge drinking, heavy drinking, drinking and driving, underage drinking, and drinking while pregnant, costs every man, woman, and child over $1,100 per year, according to the 2013 Burden of Excessive Alcohol Use in Wisconsin report. So, having made that statement, we'll now turn the time over to our questioners. And I'm not sure who has the first question, but if you will go ahead and pose that question.
Thank you for being here. The first question, Wisconsin and 3 other states allow underage drinking in a licensed establishment if alcohol is purchased by a parent, guardian, or spouse over the age of 21. What do you think the state legislature could do to reduce underage drinking in Wisconsin?
Paul, we're going to start with you with a minute and a half, and then we'll continue with each candidate for a minute and a half.
Okay, you referenced the underage drinking provision, and my first impression when I was looking at this was, well, they ought to set an age limit. And for some reason, I said it ought to be 18.
Paul, can you use the microphone?
Oh, yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I'm used to projecting a little bit, now we gotta figure out how to turn it on. There we go, test.
Test. Okay, there we go. Without contemplating this a whole lot, my first impression was, well, it shouldn't be any younger than 18 for some reason. Now, I come from an era, I grew up when there was still both the 18-year-old beer bars and then the dropping of the age limit to 18 for all alcohol, and was with the Tony Earl administration when we raised the drinking age from 18 to 19 and then from 19 to 21 based on the federal mandates. And of course, there was a lot of discussion having to do with that drinking age because Wisconsin tends to have a huge reputation around the whole country as one of the drinkier populations. I would say that we ought to establish some kind of a threshold there that says that people younger than a certain age don't drink, because I think healthy drinking habits, strong peers, strong families, strong counseling, sports and other things prevents people from getting into this activity in its entirety. I started drinking probably when I was 16 years old here in Wausau at the bars because I could get in. So if the question is, what do we do about that particular law? I think there ought to be an established age limit on that.
My name is Richard Pulcher. I grew up in southwestern Minnesota in a dry county. I did not drink until I was a senior in high school, and it was after a basketball game and we were at a friend's house. I think the answer is in the question. You just don't allow the kids to drink. If they're with their parents, they can be there, but they can't be drinking. I guess I'm done.
I would agree. I really feel that it shows very poor parenting skills if you are encouraging your children to drink. I probably grew up in the same era as Paul did, and the drinking age was 18. And what happened there was, the excuse was, well, there's nothing else to do. And I think we need to change the culture in Wisconsin from this, all there is to do is drink. I really don't know what the set age should be, definitely over 18. But the answer to the question would be no, I don't think there should be any underage drinking. I don't think children belong in a bar at all.
Thank you. I think the most important issue here is what's outlined in the sheet that you gave us about a consistent message. And if we are allowing children to drink sometimes in certain circumstances, but not in others, that is an inconsistent message. And that becomes a problem for our whole community and creates sort of the atmosphere that, oh, drinking is a treat and something that I do for special occasions. It's a reward, and that's really the wrong message. So I certainly agree that we should not be allowing parents to buy alcohol for children in bars or in restaurants. I think that we already have some good programs. Those who host lose the most. Cracking down on parents who are hosting parties is also really important and something we can continue at the state level. The other issue at the state level, what can we actually as state legislators do to reduce underage drinking? I used to work for the Boys and Girls Club. I know that they provide lots of great activities for our kids and lots of different alternatives. And I also would be very interested in extra support for after-school activities because unfortunately with shrinking budgets, lots of our school districts need to reduce those extracurricular activities, especially in rural Wisconsin, where there are fewer extra opportunities for positive interaction with the community. And so maybe we just need to set some money aside for extracurricular activities. Thank you.
Hi there, and I'm Bob Culp, and I really appreciate you all inviting me, and this forum is very important. And I've actually attended as many of the Western Marathon County Healthy Communities meetings as I could because I am passionate about this. And you know, I have a confession to make. Richard Pulcher said that he didn't drink until he was in high school, and I literally have never tasted a beer. I grew up Mennonite Amish, and that was my culture. I have a glass of wine on occasion, but that's my one claim to fame. I have a lot of other vices, so we won't go there. But as far as drinking beer, never done it. I believe it starts in the culture. We do have a culture in Wisconsin that, to some extent, celebrates drinking, and that's not something that we can just wave a magic wand at in the legislature. It simply won't happen. And I'm brand new to the legislature, only served less than a year there. And so one of the things that I've done and found effective is to ask the question back. If you were to design, and this will take a community, and I've heard some good ideas already, but if you were to design legislation that would fix this, what would that look like?
Hi, I'm Norm Solomonski. Sorry I'm late, I apologize. I think if the law is going to be changed to the age of 21, it should be age 21, period. The problem that we have here, though, is the history of doing this is really rooted in a lot of families. This is something that's been going on for a long time, and I've even heard arguments regarding that this is my grandfather did this for my dad did this for me, so on and so forth. So there is this history here that we have to look at and be able to convince people that history needs to change. There are schools, for example, where players, if they're caught drinking, get kicked off the team and have more severe penalties than they get out in the public if they're caught for underage drinking. So for that reason, I would strongly support a law that would say 21 is 21, not 18, not 16, not in certain circumstances. The other aspect we would need to look at, I think, is probably to look at what type of mandatory penalties would be happening if someone was convicted of this particular infraction.
Okay, candidates, thank you, and I'd like to welcome Norm Solomonski, who's running for the 69th Assembly District. And this is a good time to pause for just one moment and say that two candidates who could not be here, who sent their regrets, David Heaton and Jerry Petrusky. So I just wanted to mention that. I also want to especially thank Bob for being here. He actually has a conflict. Will probably be leaving us a little bit early, but thank you for taking the time to be here today. So we're going to continue on, and this time we'll have our next question, and we'll start with Bob Culp. We'll come to my right, and then we'll finish up with Norm at the end.
Thank you for being here. Alcohol misuse places significant costs on all Wisconsin taxpayers and burdens the limited resources of local law enforcement. How should the state of Wisconsin go about reducing the burden of alcohol on our state?
And I thought I would have time to think this over. I figured they'd start setting one over. And I'd get some good ideas and I would just parrot them. But in any case, again, a very good question. And I would just throw it back to everyone else. I believe that one of the things that I think is probably true about most of the issues we're discussing here is they're not, maybe I'm naive, but I don't think they're super contentious. And in light of that, I think that reasonable people can sit down and say, this would make sense. And I believe that's what we need to do with this dialogue. You know, again, because it's not so much a part of my culture, it's not something that I've dug into at the state level, I don't have a lot of good answers, but I do have good ears to listen to good answers and input from others.
Yeah, Mandy, if you please go. Yeah, we're going to go to the right.
Thank you. So the most revealing thing that I learned as a legislator on this issue was a couple months ago. I did a Wausau police ride-along. And it was fascinating. I stayed up till 2 in the morning, barely, right? But what happened is, you know, there were active things and we responded to some calls, but when there was downtime, I sat with my police officer and we just watched a stoplight. And he said, I'm checking for people to roll through, and I can guarantee you 95% of the time when people are rolling through a stoplight at 1 in the morning, it's because they've been drinking and they just left the bar. So I thought that was really fascinating, actually. And we didn't see any in a very busy intersection. It was a quiet night. He repeatedly apologized to me that there was more action. I said, that's fine. So I am certainly not opposed to checkpoints, but I think we probably need to go above and beyond checkpoints because I actually think our police officers are finding creative ways to institute checkpoints already. What that looks like is something that we do need to have as a community-wide discussion, but I do know that the beer tax hasn't been raised for a very long time, and that would provide extra resources to address this issue in a different way. And I would really like to see far more focus on prevention and treatment. We have a lot of people in our jails who have alcohol and drug abuse issues, and there's not nearly enough access to the treatment, especially if it's a mental health issue that they need. And so creative ways of finding extra revenue and hitting this issue on the front end, I think, are better than being punitive on the back end.
Again, I would think early education, for one thing, or education all along on alcohol misuse. I work in mental health and I see a lot of the self-treatment that goes on. I also am an advocate for in the emergency room setting for the women's community, and I can guarantee you there that 95% of the time alcohol is involved in those cases as well. And again, we really need to change the culture with the education, and that's going to change things along. And I think that's where we really need to start.
As you already know, I grew up in Minnesota. Minnesota has a law called dram shop. And what it is, if somebody leaves the bar, gets in an accident, and causes damage, the bar is held at least partially responsible. And what this does is it makes self-policing of drunks by the bartenders, by the bar owners. And it also gets them to encourage somebody in the bar who's not too drunk to give the guy a ride home. So I think something like this could be explored. Now, the bar owner doesn't pay out of his own pocket for the damage that's done, but he is required to have insurance that will pay, and the number of people who leave his bar and get into accidents, his insurance rate goes up. That way you're having a sober person keeping a drunk person off the road before he ever gets into trouble.
One of the things I wanted to say earlier is kind of counterintuitive, but having been in Germany where there is not a drinking age and in which there's a culture of drinking at a meal, and at times that's all you drink, it's interesting that how the culture and family kind of brings you to responsible or irresponsible drinking actions. So, but I agree with what Mandy said about a lot of the issues. Number one, I think not only the beer, but the wine and other alcohol tax, which can be controlled in part at the local level, ought to be utilized. It hasn't been raised for a while. I think there's plenty of room for them to share in the responsibility of serving, but making those bartenders responsible, designated drivers, and programs that reward people for having designated drivers and utilize them are in place. But I think really opening up the opportunity to keep some of these first-time offenders and people that are in the jail system out and find good AOD programs is essential, because there's nothing worse than seeing a family member that you know has a problem, and it's so difficult to get them into treatment because of cost factors and waiting lines.
And we'll finish up with Norbert.
On regards to sobriety checkpoints, I would be in favor of those checkpoints being in place, but I would prefer that we would have a third party do it instead of the local municipality do it, because their resources are already fairly stretched, that we would have it in conjunction with either the Wisconsin State Police and the county sheriffs to hold these sobriety checkpoints. One thing that, according to the NTSB, and this kind of relates to all the questions when we talk about alcohol in general, according to the NTSB, you are 2.5 more times to die on a rural highway than you are on an urban highway. That's a statistic from the NTSB if you're involved in an accident. So what we do here, especially in these counties here, it is critical for our citizens. And what we're talking here primarily is actually doing a paradigm shift. We're trying to dispel the old system and replace it with new beliefs, healthier beliefs, for example. But regarding going back to sobriety checkpoints, if they're random and they're staffed for a reason, I think there's no problem with doing something like that.
Thank you, candidates. Because we got started just a few minutes late, for this last question on alcohol, we'd like to keep your responses to 1 minute, okay? So please go ahead.
To date, 38 states have sobriety checkpoints and have seen significant decreases in drunk driving. In your opinion, what are some steps that state legislature can take to reduce drunk driving in Wisconsin?
We'll start with Mr. Polcher, and then we'll go to his right and continue on from there.
I was stopped once by a cop after having drunken pop all night and watching the speedometer because it was close to the deer hunting season. And he said that he had me on his radar at 65 miles an hour. And we had not gone faster than 55. The guy was trolling for drunks. If he caught us, he could end up with overtime, he could end up with all kinds of bennies. And he probably would have dropped the speeding ticket. But I got so angry and I got in his face and he backed away and left. I think we need to police the police as well as the drunks.
I am not opposed to random checkpoints. I think that the better trained our law enforcement officers are in doing things like setting up this idea that you're going to check a intersection and watch for people coming through. That means that I don't think we have to set up checkpoints along the highway in a way that infringes upon other people, but I think just that enhanced law enforcement activity, whether it's around New Year's times or around bars and taverns, is helpful, and I have no objection to that at all. But I think coming from a community that has dealt with alcoholism very deeply, that the bottom line on a lot of these answers all has to do with strong families, strong cultures, strong communities with ethics and so forth that prevent that action. My daughter organizes designated driver buses for the parties nowadays, and I'm very proud that she takes that much responsibility on behalf of her friends and family.
Thank you. Mr. Solomonsky?
I already answered this question by mistake. But the point is that I really do believe that we do need to do a paradigm shift here. And I'll reflect that in some of the other questions when we start talking about tobacco and obesity as well, that our culture is changing and the basis of our culture is changing. And as a result, we do have to embrace some new ideas and to make sure that those ideas are effective as well. Thank you.
You know, I can only imagine the horror that my sister-in-law felt when she was hit head-on by a drunk driver by Rib Lake a number of years ago on a snowy highway after dark. She lived, but she was fearful forever of going back out on the road, and still is today, or people that lose family members. And I think the ride home is a good step in the right direction, and I understand from talking to people in the tavern industry that that's working. The question I would have when it comes to checkpoints is, 38 other states, what were the challenges in getting those in place? How long have those laws been around? Have they been around since forever? Did we ever have checkpoint laws? And really, where are those checkpoints? Are they directly around a bar so you feel like an armed camp? And would everyone be stopped? I've never had beer in my life, as I told you. Would I be stopped? And would it look a little bit overbearing? So those are some of the questions that I think we would need to answer. Philosophically, I'm not opposed to doing that, but we need to keep people safe, but do it in a responsible way.
Again, I'm not opposed to sobriety checkpoints, but I think if we only focus on punishing people, it's somewhat misguided, and we've already put a lot of efforts there, and it hasn't done enough to deter the real issues in our community. So one of the most important things we could do is accept the federal funds for Medicaid, which would infuse millions of dollars into our community and make it so that our healthcare systems could more adequately address preventative healthcare needs in our community, because we've seen cuts for mental health resources, and we've seen cuts for AODA prevention, and we've seen cuts for the areas that really, unfortunately, people start to self-medicate and they get very stressed and they make poor decisions. And just telling them that they're going to go to jail or they're going to be in trouble clearly hasn't been enough in the past, and it's creating an unbearable burden on our criminal justice system.
I'm not against sobriety checkpoints to say, but I think we could better just train our officers to be aware, to be watching for this type of thing at certain times during their shifts. And I think it might just be the priorities of where we want to put our state's money, and this might be somewhere you'd want to put that. And I would agree with what Mandy said. I work in mental health, and I see the cuts, and they're pretty deep ones. We need to put our money where we need to put our money to help people. But again, you talk also to a mother who's lost her child because of a drunk driver, and she's going to tell you, the checkpoints are necessary. But I would go with just better training for officers and where they can utilize these, not just a set checkpoint system.
Okay, we've heard from all the candidates on this topic. We want to thank you. And I want to remind the audience that if you have any questions about alcohol, you're certainly welcome to write them down on the green cards, pass them to your left, and we'll be doing some audience questions at the end. We'll now turn to the issue of tobacco, and I will read a statement written by Healthy Marathon County on this topic, after which we'll begin our questions. Tobacco use is the leading cause of preventable death in Wisconsin and the United States. Even though cigarette smoking has slowly declined among adults in Wisconsin, nearly 1 in 5 Wisconsin adults still smokes. In Wisconsin, health effects of smoking contribute to $1.95 billion in out-of-pocket healthcare spending and $1.7 billion in lost productivity annually. So we'll now turn to our first question, and we will start with answering. We'll have candidate right, and then we'll move to her right.
86% of Wisconsinites enjoy and expect clean indoor air. How can the state legislature ensure that Wisconsin citizens can continue to enjoy clean indoor air?
Well, first of all, I'm fully supportive of the measures that are already in place. I think, I know it was a long, hard battle to make sure that we had smoke-free bars and restaurants, but I think it's really paying off. The next area that we really need to address, in my opinion, is vaping. We don't really know the effects of vaping yet, and there's lots of concerns about it. I've started to read some of the research, and I think we need to be proactive in making sure that we are protecting the air for Wisconsinites. Thank you.
I am the person that I'm the former smoker, so I am the worst. I definitely support clean air, and I love what we've done with taking the smoking out of the bars, out of the restaurants, and that I think we actually need to go a little bit further, because if there's anything I can't stand is when I'm walking in and I have to walk through the people with a cloud of smoke to get into the bar or the restaurant. And I too think we need to look a lot deeper into this vaping. We have no idea what the health risks are to that yet, and I think it's just something that kind of masks a problem. It's instead of quitting smoking, we just do that instead. I think that really needs to be looked at.
Smoking is addictive. Anybody with an addictive behavior is going to be a candidate for being a smoker. I think we need to look at all addictive behaviors and try and find ways that we can treat these people.
Well, quitting smoking was probably one of the hardest, if not the hardest battle that I ever went through, and it's one of the happiest times when you can be smoke-free of that habit. I don't know where the 14% of Wisconsinites who don't enjoy smoke-free air are, but one of the ways we could work on it is to find out where they are. Do we know where the 14% are? Are they just walking around out on corners breathing secondhand smoke, or no? Okay, well, if all Wisconsinites ought to have clean air, then we ought to find out where that 14% is and make sure that that's smoke-free as well. I think what Nancy said about moving back people who are outdoor smoking is a good thing. It took a long time for people to get used to move outdoors. We just got to keep moving them out of the way and keep encouraging in an educational way, I think, people never to take up the habit at all.
Actually, Wisconsin is actually doing a pretty good job regarding the smoke-free air indoors. And the American Lung Association actually gives Wisconsin an A for their quality, for smoke-free air quality for indoors. But that doesn't mean that we have to stop there. We do need to stay vigilant. As Mandy referred to, the e-cigarettes, the trendy hookah bars that are out there on campuses and things like that. Those are all things that we still need to review and look at. When e-cigarettes came on the scene, there was literally no legislation for it. The FDA is actually working to become the responsible party for e-cigarettes, and there may actually be a therapeutic reason to use e-cigarettes in actually smoking cessation.
Okay, that's everybody. For the next question, because we're doing so well timed, thank you candidates. We'll give you a minute and a half to respond to this next question. I think it's a pretty important question as well.
Knowing that no tobacco product is a safe tobacco product, in your opinion, what are the steps we should take to ensure our kids don't have access to or not attracted to these dangerous other tobacco products, such as candy-flavored cigars?
Let's have candidate Stencil start, and then we'll go to her right.
Let's do everything we can, because I was 13 years old when I started smoking cigarettes. And at that time, smoking was glorified. You know, it was the thing to do. When I was in high school, we had a smoking area. Can you believe that? Yeah. So I think Wisconsin has come a long, long way. I think we really need to maybe crack down on a lot of these tobacco companies that put out these types of ads, that put out these types of products. I'm not sure exactly how, maybe go through taxes, things like that, just make it more difficult for them to do. And again, just continue to better educate our children on their choices. Because at that young age, they have no idea how hard it is to quit. Quitting cigarettes is harder to quit than heroin. At least heroin will kill you. The smoking takes a little bit longer, and it probably does more damage.
Tax the candy cigarettes. Kid takes his little savings that his mom gives him from his allowance and goes down to the store and is going to buy candies. If you tax the candy cigarettes, he's not going to buy those for his sugar high. He's going to buy something else. It's going to be a revenue increaser. Anything that looks in there or is packaged like a cigarette or a tobacco product that is not a tobacco product should just be taxed. We don't need them. We don't need them at all.
Well, and I think that taxing authority, as much as there's this mantra that there should be no more taxes or higher taxes or anything, this is an area that I think that legislators ought to either just simply outlaw and not allow, or put a high tax on it, because I think whether it's cigarettes, cigarellos, and all kinds of other tobacco products, I don't think the taxes on a lot of the things other than cigarettes specifically have been raised in an awful long time as well. It just ought to be expensive, and that money ought to be going into back into the healthcare system. And we ought to make sure that these companies, wherever they are, know that people don't believe in these kinds of products. So as far as I'm concerned, candy flavored cigars, I'm not sure if they serve any purpose, and they either ought to be just highly taxed or outlawed.
Well, going back to national level again, the FDA has actually banned candy-flavored tobacco products. That includes the e-cigarettes. Now, what that does is that there's probably loopholes that or workarounds that manufacturers are using. So we have to make sure that those loopholes and those workarounds don't succeed. Anytime there's a type of legislation, there's always the chance or the propensity for someone to try and sidestep it if they can. E-cigarettes are kind of doing that right now, for example, but that should change within the next 18 months, hopefully, with the FDA's guidelines. Regarding our kids in general, there's probably 3 really, really important steps that influence our kids. And 1, it has to be parents, 2, it's education, and 3, it's peers. So that is really what you're up against when you're trying to change these behaviors. And sometimes the greatest of these are peers. So Who you pick as friends sometimes, makes a huge difference as well, so. But from a legislative point of view, we need to make sure that in these types of products, whether we decide to increase taxes or we increase their availability or somehow regulate them, that we do not leave open any loopholes. Thank you.
I think the first thing we can do is make sure that it's not legal to have these products out in front near candy. If traditional tobacco products need to be behind the counter, clearly products that are attractive to children need to also be behind the counter. And then I will reiterate that we certainly need to close the loopholes so that they are taxed equally. And I certainly would be interested in exploring other opportunities for making these less attractive to children.
Okay, thank you. We'll go to the next question, and we'll again have a minute and a half for response.
The CDC tells us that a comprehensive, adequately funded tobacco control program is the best way to reduce the burden of tobacco on our state. Since Wisconsin only invests about 10% of the recommended amount, how can the state of Wisconsin go about reducing the burden of tobacco in our state?
We'd like to start with candidate Solomonsky, and then we'll go to his right.
Well, as I mentioned earlier, we got an A for indoor quality from the American Lung Association. However, our state received an F for both tobacco prevention and cessation coverage. One of the issues we have, and I'm not sure how this gets funded at the state level, I must admit that, but definitely there's a way that if we can increase, there's data out there that says that if we can increase the dollars spent on education, that our outcomes can be greater. So there is proof to do that. But on a larger scale, one of the things I'd actually like to look at is to look at our healthcare coverage. For example, depending when you decide that you want to quit smoking, your healthcare coverage may not cover it. In this state of Wisconsin, private healthcare insurance does not necessarily need to provide cessation programs for you. As where, for example, state programs such as Medicaid and those that are affiliated with ACA do provide that. But there is a little bit of a catch to that. Some of them only provide one try a year. That's it. And we do know that it is necessary sometimes to try 3 or 4 times to actually succeed at beating this habit. And so one thing I would like to do is see that the insurance companies offer this program, but they offer it 2 to 3 times a year so that as the candidate's motivated, they can continue to retry and not feel like they have to wait 6 months, 9 months to be, as a failure.
Great points. Thank you. So certainly I support better education in our schools, and part of that is stable funding for education. And that is something that we can address at the state level. I think, again, accepting the federal Medicaid funds and addressing this issue of a gap in how many times you can actually access cessation programs with funding is something that's definitely worth looking at. I think it would be great if we had the resources to actually focus on points where people are more interested in addressing their smoking problem. For instance, pregnancy seems like a great intervention point, and a lot of people would be really motivated to quit at that point, but we often don't have the resources, is my understanding, to really help guide them through that process. And finally, I'd just like to bring up that when I met with the Lung Association after I got elected, they said that the #1 killer in the Hmong community in Wausau is heart disease, and they would like help with smoking cessation because they see it as a huge issue within the community. Thank you.
I would like to see healthcare fully fund smoking cessation programs. And like Norman alluded to, a lot of times it does take many times. I think I'm in the Guinness Book of World Records for how many times you can actually quit. And I'd reward myself and go down to the gas station and buy a pack of cigarettes. You did good. You could do it again. And with the state of Wisconsin, if we would have accepted those Medicaid dollars, we still can. I think that's where we need to start. I don't know how many times you have to try in a year to quit smoking, but it's a lot cheaper than treating somebody with lung cancer, with heart disease, and many other associated diseases, and secondhand smoke diseases as well.
We tax gasoline to keep track of the roads. We could tax cigarettes to fund cessation programs. Doesn't that make sense?
I agree. I talked a little bit about raising the taxes on all these tobacco-related products with that money going into health programs. I like the idea of allowing for a second try because I never had a hard time stopping. It was always just how to not pick up that next cigarette and starting again. In our community, the best success has been comparing traditional uses of tobacco, religious, cultural uses of tobacco versus recreational use, and we've had some really good inroads in our communities through that. So it has to do with family values, and I think as more adults quit utilizing, you're going to see a continued trend of less young people picking up those tobacco products as well.
Okay, again, we thank you candidates for your responses on tobacco issues, and for audience members, if you have any follow-up questions on tobacco, don't forget, please write them down and pass these cards to your left. We'll have time at the end for some audience questions. We'll now turn to the third topic for this evening, which is the topic of obesity. And again, I will read a statement that was written by Healthy Marathon County, and then we'll go to the questions. According to the Trust for America's Health, in 2013, just under 30% of Wisconsin adults were obese, continuing a steady increase in obesity over the past decade. If obesity rates continue to rise at the current pace, by 2030, the obesity rate in Wisconsin would top 56%. Obesity is known to contribute to type 2 diabetes, high blood pressure, heart disease, stroke, and cancer. In addition, the CDC reports that fewer than 1 in 4 Wisconsin adults reports eating the recommended 5 servings of fruit or vegetables per day, and more than 75% of Wisconsin adults reported participating in no leisure time physical activity or exercise in the prior month. So we will begin our questions on obesity, and I do think we have a minute and a half for each answer, and this time we'll, after the first question, we'll start with Representative Wright and go to her right.
Good nutrition is essential to good health and disease prevention. However, low-income and rural communities often have limited access to healthy food. What are some steps you think the state legislature could take to create a healthier food environment for all of Wisconsin citizens?
Thank you for the question. So first of all, I support the farm to school grants. It's $400,000 that was not appropriated this past year, that was cut, and I was the lead on reinstating the farm to school program at the same level that it was last time. I would like to see it boosted, but unfortunately we didn't get it even at the meager $400,000. I've been doing a lot of tours of rural communities and talking about rural education, and I've been doing so with Republican Senator Dale Schultz. And part of our presentation is an interactive map that shows the state of Wisconsin and how the demographics have changed over the past 10 years. And what you can see when you look at those maps is we have the same rate of enrollment of school children across the state of Wisconsin on average, but families are moving out of rural Wisconsin. You can also see the increase in free and reduced lunch levels, and that is increasing dramatically, especially in our rural areas, but it has increased from 21% to 42% within the past 10 years, doubled. So what I think we really need to do about this is we need to invest in our rural communities. We need infrastructure, we need access to broadband, we need to improve our roads, we need to help make sure that there are strong communities, we need good family supporting jobs, we need to increase the minimum wage, and we need to pass fair funding for our future, which will provide adequate funding for our public schools.
All of what Mandy said and more. Kids spend, 2/3 of their time in schools, and that's where we're cutting all of our money. And I think this is where, you know, the best education can start. They don't always get that great education at home. And if they learn this in school, they can, you know, begin to take this home. And along with that, the family farms, bringing back the food into the schools through the farm. And along with, you know, community-based agriculture and teaching kids to once again live a little bit healthier. And like where we're cutting into schools, they're not getting the physical education that they once did either, so they're not getting that exercise, and I think we need to start putting our money back in there. And along with that, as Mandy said too, raising the minimum wage. There's no reason on the face of this earth why somebody who's working a 40-hour week should have to rely on food share. And they should be able to feed their family in a decent manner. Thank you.
I like the idea of eating locally grown food. If we could do this in our schools and our hospitals and whatever, for some reason, years ago, they decided that locally grown food was unhealthy and the stuff you get off a truck is better for you. I just don't think that has shown to be the case. And as far as the schools are concerned, we could have courses in nutrition and gardening and teach kids how to use their backyard to get their own healthy foods. I know growing up in a farm, my folks didn't have money for all kinds of food. So my mom had this great garden and we ate really well.
I think it's getting back to feeding ourselves first, learning how to feed ourselves totally as a community. I know the Winona LaDuke, the vice presidential candidate, the Nader LaDuke ticket, was talking to her father about tribal sovereignty, and her dad turned around and says, look, don't talk to me about tribal sovereignty or self-sufficiency until you learn how to grow corn. And it had to do with feeding your own communities. If you look at the descriptions of a lot of our communities, we used to have gardens, and I was actually pretty intrigued by the number of home gardens and garage gardens that we find knocking on doors on Wausau's west side where people are growing their own food. Our kids don't even know how to cook nowadays. They warm things up, kind of a mantra. So we got to get back. 25 to 30 years ago, we barely had any diabetes in the Native community. And now it's at an outrageous rate, and it's devastating in a lot of ways, and it has to do with getting away with locally grown food. You know, and I have this gut reaction because a lot of these things are mandates and legislation and those kinds of things that say, I mean, I'd like to ban a good portion of Walmart products and big box products right out of the stores and say, you know, until we can spend as much attention on the farmer's market, we ought to stay away from these other places where all you got to do is open something up and throw it in an oven and warm it up rather than learning how to live it. We know that good food is healthy and it'll prevent more than just diabetes and obesity issues. It'll take care of a whole realm of mental health care, out of balance, chemicals and other things. So we just got to get back to feeding ourselves with locally grown foods and good foods.
Well, statistically, we know that lower income families can have a much higher percentage of obesity, and in some cases as much as 50% greater chance based on certain demographics. If you're a low income family, you're worried about putting food on the table, not necessarily what that food is. I think that's one of the questions that needs to be answered. So if we have a lower income family, and for example, if they are getting food subsidies, let's take a look at what those food subsidies are. What are we approving for the WIC program? Can we weight average or change the way that we grant WIC to favor foods that are definitely more nutritious or even locally grown? Kelly Westland, who's running for Congress here, she actually put together a program up in the Ashland district where she got farmers together with people to buy their products. That may be something that could be beneficial. But again, you're looking at a family that they're not necessarily worried what kind of food, they're just trying to put food on the table. And a couple of the other candidates here had talked about the minimum wage of $10.10 an hour, raising the minimum wage. The next time you go to a fast food store, or a fast food restaurant, excuse me, look across the counter and see how many teenage kids you see there. I see a lot of 20-year-olds, 30-year-olds, and 60-year-old people working behind that counter. So when you hear the argument that we can't do that because it kills teenage jobs, it's not teenagers that are working there.
Okay, thank you. We're ready for our next question, and afterwards we'll have candidate Domain start the answering.
According to the state of Wisconsin's Department of Health Services, nearly half of the population of Wisconsin does meet the recommendations for physical activity. What are some steps you think the state legislature could take to create opportunities for all of Wisconsin's citizens to be physically active?
It just seems to be such a strange question, because it's like saying, okay, what we're going to do is pass a law that mandates that everyone has to take at least 2 days out of the month and not utilize their cars. We're going to ban the use of cars so you get off your butt and get some exercise. How do we mandate something like that? I think Wisconsin has been a leader in parks and recreational trails and all these things. They are there. But how are you going to force people to actually get out and get some exercise? I mean, it's hard to believe that we're dealing with that kind of an issue. From a legislative point of view, I think we just have to provide those opportunities and start them in our schools, recreational activities, get out there and learn how to walk in those parks and go to the Fat Tire festivals and get involved in things. And life is so much more beautiful when you're healthy in a general way. Sorry if I don't have a concrete idea.
I think we need to answer the question, what's in it for me for them? That's the question that needs to be answered. For example, I think we need to reward positive health improvement. If we were to take diabetes, for example, we know that in instances, if you can be more active, you can lose weight, you have a better, higher quality of life. But right now, there are no rewards for doing that except a pat on the back. So let's say, for example, we were to set up, and I'm going to go back to my health insurance example. What happens with a health insurance if you have a $5,000 deductible? And let's say you're diabetic, and your A1C when you start out, which is a measurement of your blood sugars, which is very quantifiable. There's no strange boogie with it at all. I mean, it's a hard fact. Let's say you start out, maybe your A1C is at 8, and your doctor says, okay, when I see you in 6 months, maybe I can get you get your A1C down to 7.4. Okay? We can go ahead and do that. Let's say, for example, that patient's able to do that. They lead an active health style. They watch what they eat. They exercise. Now, all of a sudden, maybe we can credit their deductible back. Instead of them having a $5,000 deductible, why don't they now have a $4,000 deductible or a $3,000 deductible? It's kind of the same premise you see used on TV for car insurance. If you don't get into an accident, there's there's accident forgiveness. Let's do the same thing for health. If we want to be healthy, let's reward people for doing something healthy.
So I would agree with that, and I think it would be great if we had more proactive health plans. I also think it's important to support alternative transportation. I'm a big fan of biking and walking, but the truth is it's pretty difficult to live in Wausau and only bike and walk. I was able to make it work sometimes in my life, but right now it's simply not possible. So I'd certainly like to see further investments in bike and pedestrian opportunities. And we do have a public transportation referendum coming up on the ballot this cycle. That's extremely important that we make sure that people have access to public transportation, and I think that it really ties into the overall health of our community. I personally have found that when I have a lot of stress in my life or economically I'm not as prosperous, it's more difficult for me to find the time or the resources to exercise in the way that I would like. And so I think that underlying all this, of course, including good programs in schools, which we do have. I'm really confident of that. And help for adults through their healthcare plans and good community infrastructure is really helping our families be more prosperous so that they have that discretionary funding to buy a mountain bike or to try kayaking or to try those fun activities that get them out and get them active.
Well, I would agree with Norb on the health insurance. My health insurance actually has started this where if we do a health risk assessment, we get a little cut on our insurance, which it not only, when it hits your pocketbook, you think about it more. And at the same time, it puts those numbers in front of your face so that you're looking at them and you're seeing, well, gee, maybe I need to change a little of this or a little of that. And as far as legislation that could be passed, again, that's prioritizing where we put our monies. And my district is in bad need of the bus service over in Weston, so please vote yes on November 4th to that. And another thing is, as far as legislation, is what we could help you do in your community when you organize something, say for bike trails and or public transportation. That's where we come in if we need to help you change your zoning or something like that. But otherwise, be aware and be involved in your community. For many, many years, I put on the candlelight snowshoe hikes up on Red Mountain. And we started out, we'd only have like maybe 25 people coming to these, and by the time I handed down that torch, it was a full house every time. So get involved in your community.
When I was in my late 20s, I was director of community education for our small school district. One of the most successful programs that we had was a volleyball league, a half-court basketball, and these were as simple as letting you open the school sometimes for kids who wanted to get in there and exercise. We have the facilities, and as our population is decreasing, they're underutilized. So I think if we could promote using our schools after hours for adults and kids and try and make this just a popular thing to do. It's cheaper than going to a bowling alley, and it's a lot more healthy than joining a dart league.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, candidates. I just want to remind the audience that you have a couple more minutes to write your questions down, pass them to the left, and we'll collect them at the end. We'll now have our last question on obesity, and this time, although I know Candidate Poulter, you may have addressed this a little bit, we'll start with you this time around.
All right, today's kids are being diagnosed with obesity-related chronic diseases, normally only found in adults. What are some steps the state legislature could take to reverse this troubling trend?
Well, I think we've covered it. Exercise, exercise, exercise. We certainly don't want to stop the intake that kids are having because they're going to be hungry for the things they need. I know growing up, when I was small, they used to feed me first, and then when I got to be a teenager, I got fed last because if I wasn't, there'd be nothing for anybody else. So we have to have exercise programs. Kids are going to eat different amounts as they grow and let their bodies tell them what they're going to eat. But they need to stay active. They need to grow in mind and body and spirit, and we need to give them every opportunity to do that.
Well, I think we've heard some of the ideas here earlier. That is try to make sure that what we're serving our kids in school is the healthiest it can be, that we're rewarding people in insurance policies to help bring down obesity in our children, trying to keep them active in sports, trying to keep them active after hours, trying to get them off that couch and away from the computer at least part of the day, trying to take them, like I did with my grandchildren during this campaign, all over Wisconsin and show them all the beautiful places there are to get involved in things that you can do, and say, take care of your body. You know, even here, someone says, you know, we don't have sausage here, and we're not gonna serve fried bread, and we're not gonna have other things here because it's about the health of ourselves. And so at every point, if we talk about the health of our family, the health of our children, if we set a good example, if we grow our own fruits and vegetables and set that example again for our children, I think our children will grow up in a better way, more cognizant of what the health factors are. What can the legislature do? Again, it seems to me it has to do about education, properly funded education and curriculum that allows our children to be taught proper and good thinking processes.
This was actually a tough question for me because I was trying to think from a legislative point of view what could be done. And directly, I cannot see anything truthfully that a legislature can do on this particular problem. However, what I can see legislation do is actually provide a support for this type of thing. And what I mean by that is just to have things such as able to earn a decent wage, making sure what's in the programs such as the WIC program do meet nutritional needs. That, for example, funding to school meal plans does not get cut where they have to pick and choose things like, you know, which is this based on dollars, not necessarily based on nutrition. So those are things that the legislature can do as far as supporting these types of things. But this is what I was talking about, a paradigm shift. If you look at all the research that's out there, there's a ton of research that says, you know, you need to exercise 5 times a week, you need to exercise 3 times a week. You know, what is the best type of exercise and what type is it going to be for example, low income or single family? You know, these are the people that we're talking about. You know, how do we connect with them to make that difference, to understand that in the long run they'll be much healthier people?
So first of all, 1 out of 8 people in Wisconsin live in poverty right now. It's dramatically increased over the past 10 years, not just children, but adults too. And since there's such a strong correlation between low income and obesity, especially with children, I really truly believe that making sure that we have family supporting jobs, that parents can work and then have the funds to put good food on the table for their kids is critical. Actually, there's also been cuts recently to food share, and there's talk of drug testing in order to receive food share, especially this next session. That seems to be a top priority in the assembly for some people. So that is obviously extremely dangerous if we want our kids to be well fed. I will say for the last time, we need to accept the federal Medicaid funds for preventative health so that families can adequately come in and get good meal plans and talk to their healthcare providers about this. I also think, again, we need to stabilize school funding. I talked to lots of education professionals who are telling me that they have to make cuts in the healthcare services that they provide for the kids because there's only so much funding in the school budgets these days. I do see some very creative solutions happening in some of our rural northern districts where healthcare services are being infused into the school district, and that's very exciting. And finally, the top issue that came out of our Marathon County Life Report was addressed early childhood brain development and trauma, and I served on a bipartisan task force for that, and I think the most important thing we can do is increase the reimbursement rates for Wisconsin shares. Congressman Pocan just pointed out very recently that we have refused to apply for $60 million in federal funding for early childhood. That's not acceptable. We need to invest in our young kids.
What the legislature can do is help to provide you with jobs that pay a living wage so that you can afford to put food on the table. We can prioritize where we stick our money instead of at the very top, or road expansions that do very little for anybody. Put it back in your local communities, for your own local roads, for your bus transportation, take and fund the schools at the rates they should be funded at, because when our children are not home, where are they? They're in our schools, and we rely on those great public schools to help our children and to teach them, and they need the funding in order to do that. Along with that, we need to accept Medicaid funds so that we can be a healthier Wisconsin.
Well, that ends our formal round of questions, and I would like to actually praise the candidates for the exactitude with which you kept in the time constraints. Please give them a round of applause for that. And you're not done. We will have a few audience questions, so I'm going to ask Joan to come forward and okay, so we have some questions, and I think we'll just try to make it easy on ourselves. So maybe candidate Salamanski, if you could start and be the first to answer, and then we'll go down the list if you'd like to answer. These two questions are very similar, so I'm going to ask them kind of both together. Research shows that physically active students learn better. How can the state of Wisconsin assure students are getting the recommended 60 minutes of physical activity every day? And then a similar question, would you support mandating that kids get physical education in school every day?
Well, I'm going to answer the second one first, and I'm not sure that you could mandate that they get 60 minutes of exercise every day during a school day. In order to do that, you'd probably have to extend the school day seriously to do that effectively. And if that's the outcome that we choose, that's fine. I mean, we can do that. As far as it goes for the Department of Education and Instruction here in the state, we need to make sure that the students do indeed have a well-rounded education, which does include physical activity, does include gym, does include music, does include art. Unfortunately, a lot of these things are under attack because of the lack of funding to schools. So you look at where schools make cuts, and they usually cut some of those programs. So we have to ensure that those programs continue. And the sidebar to this is private schools in some cases don't even offer the same types of programs like this, nor do they need to. So from that perspective, you know, we need to take a lead, and we need to demonstrate that students getting this exercise are actually being healthier and learning better. And along that same question, by the way, one of the things that happens too is if kids are fed, they do much better in school. My wife is a special ed teacher in the Marshfield School District. We do have a line entry in our budget for food for the kids because the kids come to school hungry and they don't qualify for breakfast or lunch programs. And as a result, Julie ends up feeding them, and she does that in the 10 minutes it takes. They learn much better when their tummies are full. That's a fact.
So I think everyone knows I was a teacher and I always tried to fit movement into my classroom. But as far as actually requiring more phy-ed, this came up as a bill last session, and as much as I wanted to say yes, because as much as I know that more movement helps children, the fact is there really is not time in the school day. And with all of the pressures on our schools right now, without increased funding, it's simply impossible. So what I think we need to do is look for alternative solutions instead of trying to cram everything we want our kids to do and be into the school day. We need to make sure that there are adequate opportunities outside of school. And something that I've seen that's kind of tragic, because I grew up in Wausau 20 years ago, and we had an activity bus, and I had to ride it for an hour and a half to get all the way home north of Brokaw, but it was there, and so I could stay after school for activities and participate in lots of sports after school. I've talked to lots of administrators across our state, and with the decrease in funding for schools, transportation and after-school transportation, that is one of the things that is cut the quickest. So I think we need to be supporting our families and making good decisions and finding alternate activities for those kids and not try so hard to force it within the school day, because I just don't think it's realistic.
I would agree with Mandy on this one. I can remember we always had the activity buses. And I do think we need, as Richard said too, to utilize our schools, because you don't have to belong to a big fancy gym or anything else to get the exercise. Where we used to just go into the gym and play basketball after school, or on days where there wasn't anything going on there. And I think we need to bring some of that back. And I don't know if the funding could be put back in for activity buses, but maybe we could fund our mass transit a little bit better so some of these kids could get home that way. Carpool, things like that. Look for creative alternatives. Look for things out in your community that your kids can do.
I have to plead ignorance on this one. They don't have Fayette in school anymore?
Certainly they do,
Oh.
not 60 minutes.
Well, yeah, it's basically, they call them hour classes, and the classes aren't quite 60 minutes, and then you have to shower afterwards, and you have to get dressed beforehand. Growing up, I was kind of involved in athletes. I wasn't a real good athlete, but I was involved in them. But just about everybody in our small school was participating in extracurricular sports. Well, in a big school, if you have a basketball team, you might have 10 kids out of a class of 200. You need something for the rest of the kids. And intramural sports, leagues for both men and women is something that should be encouraged. Because I don't like exercising, but I do like having fun. And so if you can come up with programs after school that are fun for people, wouldn't that be great?
Well, after-hour programs certainly are one answer, but when you don't have the money to do that, that's more difficult. So proper funding so that there is activities after hours is great. How do you get 60 minutes in a day? Coming off a farm where I worked during the summer times, we had no problem getting plenty of exercise. And with today's fuel prices, sending kids to the woodshed for chopping might be a good way to cut your energy costs down or something. You got to make that extra effort. Being on this campaign and having to drive 3 hours to go to Marshfield or to Wittenberg or to Wausau or anything doesn't get me a whole lot of exercise coming back and forth. So I have to go out of my ways to make sure that I'm out in the woods, that I'm taking my daily walk, that I'm doing a run, that I'm active with the kids. And again, it has to do with family activities, it has to do with school activities, making sure that those kids are out there being involved and focusing them on those healthy things. How do you get kids to eat potato skins because they're healthier than the white stuff in the middle? And how do you get them to eat apple peelings because that's the healthy part of an apple? How do you change the way people eat so they're eating healthier? How do you get them out there and being active? You ban them from sitting on the couch for hours and on end. You got to turn that TV down. I actually went in and took the TV out of my living room at one point because I turned it off. I came back, it was on, no one was there. Turned it off, an hour later it was on again. I have 12 grandchildren, 4 kids of my own, by the way. So I finally took the TV out of the living room and got rid of it. And that resolved the issue of people trying to sit in front of the TV when they had any spare time. There was no TV anymore there. They've all gone to their computers and everything else nowadays as grandchildren, but for my children, I got rid of the TV, so.
Okay, thank you, candidates. We have a couple of questions related to tobacco use and the budget, so I'm going to ask both of these to you. And I think this time around, whoever wants to start, please go ahead, and then we'll just, if you'd like to answer, just pick up the microphone. Tax revenue from tobacco was taken away for preventive programs when the state budget needed to be balanced. Now that the budget is balanced, how do we get this money back to these programs. And the related question is, for tobacco, is increasing funding for tobacco control, which once was a popular response, is it realistic to expect that to happen in light of the tight state budget?
Question.
I challenge that the budget is balanced. When we have our village board meetings, we have our treasurer say, well, we spent so much and this is what we spent it for. We took in so much and this is what we got it from. We have so much in our general account, we have so much in our savings accounts. When you talked about the budget, there's all kinds of different figures floating around there. Now, I have tried to do this on my own and to make sense of it, but I think we bonded about $1 billion, which meant we borrowed it. And now at the end of the year, we've got a $500 million surplus. We can't run our homes that way. And to say we have a surplus after we've borrowed $1.5 billion doesn't mean anything. We have to have honest reporting to the people in order to know if the budget is balanced or not. Now, one of the things I found out as I was looking at this is that before Governor Doyle took office, our Standard & Poor's credit rating was AA-. When he left office and Governor Walker took office, our Standard & Poor's credit rating was AA. And in 2012, after 2 years of Walker fixing everything, our Standard & Poor's credit rating was AA. All he did was talk. He didn't do anything. He shuffled some funds around and whatever. He didn't fix anything. So, first of all, let's not, now, I'm just challenging the assumption that was given. And I think everybody here needs to say, okay, what are the numbers? What are the numbers? I don't think we can expect our village president to tell us what kind of shape our village is in when he looks at the checking account balance.
I think the question, the intent of the question is not necessarily just did it balance the budget, it is did money that was taken from tobacco control programs and revenue generated for that purpose that was then used to try to balance the budget, should we be putting money back into those control programs, and is that realistic under a tight budget situation?
Well, we have that with transportation fund to the general fund and back again. This is just deception. So, yeah, we have to keep our funds together. I guess I've made my point. Anyone else?
Well, again, it's a matter of priorities, because when you're working on a budget, you're raising taxes, you're shifting program monies from one area to another, you're getting rid of exemptions, you're raising the earned income credit, you're reinstating the estate tax or taking it away, you're doing all kinds of things. There's hundreds of things that you can do in order to bring your budget into a balanced budget, which is required by the state constitution. Every single governor, every single legislature has to do it at the beginning of the budget period, and there are all adjustments that take place. The question is, where are the priorities? Just like in the transportation fund with the gasoline tax, if that money is supposed to go to transportation, that's where it's supposed to go. If you're generating money from the taxation of cigarettes, that money probably ought to go into healthcare and regulatory authorities, law enforcement authorities over the actions of cigarette transactions in the state, and that's generally speaking where it ought to go. Right now there's a constitutional amendment that says if the gasoline tax is raised or that money goes into the fund, that it can't be used for the general fund. So you have these areas that are going to be highly segregated. The only way that I can see for us to get out of this issue of, okay, we have a deficit, now we got to take the money away from AODA programs or cigarette cessation programs or whatever it is begin to look at investing in the long term in trust funds and endowments, which the state has a portfolio in which there are segregated funds for education or health needs or AODA or transportation, and so that we don't have just a rainy day fund, but when we're selling state assets or raising money, that we're attempting to set aside those funds so that someday when we get enough in that fund, we spend 85% of the interest generated on an annual basis so that there is always money there into the future. It's similar to the Alaskan Fund and the tax on the oil revenues. They sock that money away. They manage a portfolio for the state of Alaska, and because of that, every resident gets money back each year. But they have a guaranteed amount of revenue operating off that so that during recessionary times, you have less interest and less money, but all of a sudden there aren't these budget crises, and you try to take out some of these ups and downs where all of a sudden one governor thinks that you ought to do this and shift this around, or some other entity takes money away. But that money that's coming from cigarette taxations, money coming from alcohol taxes and so forth, should simply be focused on those programs on the opposite end for healthcare needs and educational needs in those areas.
Thank you. Okay, I saw candidate Salomonsky and then candidate Stenzel. Thank you. Appreciate that.
Yeah, regarding this particular situation, I think the question, and thank you for rereading the question, because the last thing I want to do is answer a wrong question already. I've already accomplished that here today. You know, the question becomes is, what are we going to do as a state? If we believe that what we need to do as a state is to make sure our citizens stay healthy, if we are to improve the lifestyle of all Wisconsinites, then the answer to that question is pretty simple in my head. It's yes. You replace those. Period. End of statement. If you don't believe that, or you have a some type of agenda that you don't think that lifestyle should be improved for all Wisconsinites, that we should all be healthier, you know, then the answer is no. To me, from that perspective, it's a pretty simple yes or no question.
I would pretty much follow what Norm said. I think, again, it's priorities where your money should go. If you're going to balance, and you know, every governor has to have a balanced budget, but where did it get balanced? You know, it got balanced on our backs. And I think you need to start with the people. You need to take care of the people in your state first, and the rest would fall in line.
Well, I'll just clarify that the Legislative Fiscal Bureau, which is the gold star of economics in Wisconsin and what our budget really looks like, has come out and said that we are facing a $1.8 billion projected deficit. And if you'd like the breakdown on that, Wisconsin Public Radio, Sean Johnson, who's our capital reporter, has been running a really good in-depth report on that for the past day or two. I've heard it 2 times now. So if you want to know if we have a deficit or not, I would say yes, and many sources will verify that. As far as if Wisconsin actually invested the recommended $10 per person, so, I mean, I guess I just put that out there and saying that we don't have lots of extra money, unfortunately. But I do think that we can do some creative things. And if we increased our investment in smoking cessation from $1 to $10, according to the information you've given me, we would save $77 million in Medicaid healthcare costs, and that is an incredible amount of savings. So where do we find the money to invest up front so we make the savings later on? This is a top issue of the Wisconsin Hospitals Association. Their Medicaid reimbursement for the state of Wisconsin is second lowest in the nation, and that is really affecting the care that we can provide to our communities. And so I would like to see some of our heavy hitters get on board with making sure we have better access to preventative health care, which they are, but this is one in particular, a very specific issue, that if we got some of our stronger advocates for health care in Wisconsin on board with advocating for $10 per person in smoking cessation, we will reap those benefits and it will benefit us all.
Thank you. Here's another question. We're going to change topics a little bit here. What can be done to get the repeat drunk drivers off the roads? Why should we see someone with any more than 2 to 3 DWIs?
It's not illegal for them to drink. Once they're drunk, they're really not in charge of their own facilities. What we have to do is make sure that bartenders, other patrons of the bar, and encourage programs to watch after these people and help them get a ride home. Like I said, I grew up in a dry county. One thing that I did here that we always did is the guy gets too drunk, we take his keys, 2 of us go. One takes him home, one takes his car home. It's pretty simple. You can't expect somebody who's really not sane anymore to be making responsible decisions.
Would anyone else like to respond?
Well, I think we're seeing our communities increasing the penalties on drunk driving again and again. It's unfortunate that we are seeing people who are in their 4th and 5th and 6th drunk driving charges, but I know that as communities, as the community pressure our judges to become more strict, that we're seeing more people with interlock devices and having to keep an ankle bracelet on and having extensive loss of privileges. We are seeing people doing lengthy county time nowadays. So I think we're beginning to see an increase in actions in our community. At least that's my perspective. That we're beginning to see some reaction to it, and it takes people like the citizens here to make sure that our judges are making those strict penalties on people who are getting into their 2nd, 3rd, and 4th drunk driving charges.
So I'm not opposed to ignition locks and sobriety checkpoints and safe rides home. But again, I really think it's most important that we support people in being healthier. And not everyone makes that decision right away. Sometimes it takes a long time, but when they do make the decision that they want help, we need to be there with the resources for them. I spent 5 hours out knocking doors on the west side the other day, and I was really hungry. I hadn't had any food, so I stopped at a local bar for a fish fry. And somebody came up to me and said, "Are you Mandy Wright?" And I said, "Yes, I am." I didn't quite know what he was going to ask me about. And he said, "What do you think about heroin and drug abuse in our community?" So I started talking about being involved in community health, and it's clearly something we need to address. And he said, "I was addicted to painkillers. I used drugs. I was a good taxpayer too, but I got myself addicted. I have an addictive personality. I realized this wasn't the behavior that was healthy for me and my family, so I went and I looked all over Wausau. I asked for help and I asked for help, and there was no one. I could not get help. I could not find the resources that I need." And so he said that he got himself off those painkillers and weaned himself off. But he said, "But clearly I still drink too much," and I would say yes, that was readily apparent. And so it just really highlighted to me. I don't mean to criticize any of our healthcare communities. I know lots of people here work really hard on making sure that there are opportunities, but even if they do exist, clearly it's not enough. And clearly we need to provide more support for community health so that when people do want to stop and change their behavior, they have the support available to them. And that is really where I think we should be focused.
It's interesting that Wisconsin is the only state that has the first offense as a misdemeanor. All the other states treat it differently. So the question has to be asked why. And I think this is even related to the fact about underage drinking. Parents buying their child a beer, or adults buying their kids alcohol. Again, this is one of these paradigm shifts I talked about, that we need to change how we view things and what is really important to us. The second aspect is it may come time for the legislature to look at how we're treating penalties for DUIs. Maybe instead of having a range of penalties, it's a mandatory penalty. There is no wiggle room. That if you do this, this is what happens. If you do this again, this is what happens. And have it be set so that you know exactly what the consequences are, where it may not be a range of 5 days in jail or 6 months in jail or whatever. But again, we need to change that because when we originally looked at treating the first offense as a misdemeanor, it was thought of that this was actually a good idea because it would free up DA's limited resources to be used in more severe type activities, more severe crimes. And through the years, it's been showing that even though that has happened in some cases, you still read about people that 4, 5 times they get stopped. Or unfortunately, on their third one, somebody gets hurt or worse, even are killed. And that's all things that are preventable. That may be something that the legislature can look at again. I'll be honest, it would be a very tough nut to crack. There are a lot of PACs that are adverse to this. They want to protect their territory, and it is not an easy fight to do. But if you have enough ground support, I think it is a fight that we can win, if that's what society and Wisconsinites really want.
Well, I really don't think incarceration is really the answer to this, but I would say mandatory education for drug and alcohol if you are caught. A lot of times it can intervene on a problem that might be starting, and of course there are people that are still going to do 2, 3 times before they get it right. But if you continue to make them go for education, somewhere along the line, it will sink in.
Okay, thank you. I think we have time for one more kind of quick question here. And so if you can kind of limit your responses to 30 seconds or less, we'd appreciate it. Would you support a tax on sugar-sweetened beverages to fund obesity prevention?
Yes. Yes.
I would be inclined to study the issue a little bit. I know that there's been some other states and cities that have tried to impose on that, and I think we've had both successes and unsuccessful attempts. But the issue of sugar in general, not just soda, the question of use of sugar in other products, but especially soda, prime causer of diabetes, I think needs to be looked at and responded to as just a health concern. So my answer would be I'd like to study it. I think we ought to get it out of the schools for one thing. I think that just ought to be a voluntary situation. Get the sugar-laden drinks out of our school system first.
I would agree with Paul on just getting them out of the school to start with and study it further. But definitely the sugars in all products. We put far too much sugar, and when we don't put sugar in, we tend to put sodium in. So, and that's a big killer both ways.
I want to start out by thanking my fellow candidates, the organizers, and everyone who attended because I neglected to do that at the beginning of this forum. So truly, thank you for coming. This is something that I really would be very interested in looking at. I can tell you that when it comes to addictive personality, sugar is my issue, and I actually had gestational diabetes with 2 of my children, and so I've looked into this a lot and joined a CSA because of it and really made sure that I was eating healthier. I think it is something that is just sort of accepted in our society that we eat sugar and reward our kids with sugar as a prize. And as far as if a tax is actually the right way to go, it's something to consider. I wouldn't say yes or no, but I certainly think more community information, more access to information is really important, and there may be other ways we can get at that. Thanks.
Okay, thank you. Now, we're at the point in the evening where we promised that we would allow each candidate to make a 1-minute closing statement, hopefully addressing to some extent the issues we talked about. Mandy, it sounded a little like that might have been a closing statement, but actually we were going to start in reverse alphabetical order, so you get to go first, followed by Nancy Stenzel, Norbert Solomonski, Richard Pulcher, and Paul DeMay.
So again, thank you very much for coming. And really thank you for engaging us as candidates in these issues. These are important issues. Community health is something that we play an important role in as state legislators, and I'm really thrilled that there are people who are wondering about our specific stances on specific issues. I guess overall, I really do think that if we want a healthier community, there are 3 basic things that we at the state level can do, and that is making sure that when people go to work, it pays, and that they can support their families and help get healthier food on the table, that our schools are appropriately funded so we can meet the needs of our children and do what's best for them, and that our healthcare system has the support that it needs. And a big step in doing that would be to accept those federal funds. Because we really do want, I believe it's an ethical issue, that everyone have access to quality, affordable healthcare. And right now I meet people every day who literally do not have access to healthcare insurance, and it's hurting our entire community. It's definitely something we need to resolve. Thank you.
Thank you. Candidate Stencil.
Thank you also for everybody that came, everybody that put this together. It was wonderful that everybody came. And I think we need to stay with community. That's where everything starts. And we need to ask ourselves when we're making these decisions on budgets or anything else in our community. Does it show fairness? And does it show respect for everybody? And who benefits from it? And you really need to ask yourself who benefits from these things. Does everybody benefit or just the social few? And when I say start locally, I work in community treatment. And there's high needs out there, people that are not being serviced, all the way down to our wonderful warming center. You think people choose to sleep under a bridge when it's 20 below out? This is where our monies need to be going. Not to build bigger, better roads. Currently, we just don't have that kind of money, but we need to invest in our people.
Thank you. We'd like to now turn the time over to candidate Salomonsky.
Thank you, and I do apologize for being late. I am a pharmacist, and unfortunately I couldn't leave work at the time that I had decided to leave. And sometimes when a lady's 70 years old and she's got a lot of questions about medicine, you just can't say, gotta go. So I do apologize for that. Healthcare is extremely important to me. In fact, that's one of the reasons why I decided to get into this race in the 69th district, is because of healthcare. It is something that affects every one of us. It affects us whether we are a business owner, whether we are an employee, whether we're union, non-union, whether we're low income, high income. It is something that affects every Wisconsinite. And as a result, the things that are happening down in Madison regarding healthcare is not advantageous for Wisconsin. And I stress that it's not advantageous for Wisconsin. And in some cases, it's even less advantageous in the 69th district that I'm running for. We need to make a decision, and we need to make a decision and let our politicians know what is important to us. Are we going to support plans that help everyone in the state, that we are healthier, that we help our farmers get their products to marketplace, that we do fund things such as smoking cessation in all our healthcare plans, that we do help people succeed? One of the greatest benefits of a legislature is not necessarily, in my mind, solving a problem, but it's giving people the support system that they need to solve that problem. So that means making sure they have health care, making sure they have a decent wage, making sure they have access to quality education. If we can do that, and in the process of also making sure we have jobs, we can make the state much, much better in the next 5 or 10 years than it is now. That we may not even recognize from where we've come from to where we've gone, because it has become so much better. I thank you for the opportunity, and again, like a pharmacist, I thank you for having me, because healthcare is extremely important to me.
Thank you. We'll now hear from candidate Polcher.
I'm going to ask a question. Is the health of the poorest person in Wisconsin more valuable than the tax break for the richest? Now, probably all of you will answer that the health of the poorest person is more important. But there are a lot of people out there that put high priority on tax breaks for people who have more money than they need, which they have made here in Wisconsin, probably selling stuff to poor people. So I guess I'd like to thank you all for having me here and for putting this on. And you might want to tell someone who really wants the tax break for the rich person to try and convince him to stay home from the poll.
Well, I want to thank you all for coming here this evening, and I have the hunch that from looking out there into the audience that there's some people that have some really good answers and perspective to what we're talking about, because otherwise you wouldn't have been here. It kind of reminds me of some of the discussions I had years ago in the AODA field and cigarettes, consumption and so forth back home, and I've kind of been out of that circle of healthcare providers for a number of years. So in a way I was hoping to come here and see a much more broader discussion, because I think everyone has some good ideas. But as Norbert said, and I suspected that he was in some kind of a healthcare field here, looking down at the other end because of some of his answers, that perspective from a pharmacist perspective, a perspective from doctors who are working with patients, a perspective from people who work in mental health care is so important, because it brings down to those intimate, small ideas that change people's lives and sometimes save them. If we can do that for one individual, we've made a difference. And that's where we got to get to. As Norbert said, some of it's about extending those resources to people so that you can make your own decisions. And so one of the last things I can offer up is this. When you ask about the banning of sugar, we have a natural resource in Wisconsin called maple sap, and we ought to be looking at some of those natural sweeteners that are highly nutritious, that aren't coming from just worthless corn syrup or even from cane sugar or sugar beet sugar that we have. We have white and yellow birch in northern Wisconsin that is highly medicinal and antioxidant, but we ought to look at those natural things that we have around us as cures, because at least in the stories that I've heard from our elders, that for everything that is created in the human body, the Creator made a cure for it as well, or something that would remedy that. And so sometimes when I am accused of fighting the mind in northern Wisconsin, one of the most interesting persons I met up there who was committed to fighting that mind was a scientist that was committed to studying the mushrooms in the Pinocchio Range. And he says, this little mushroom here has 10 times more vitamin D than a gallon of milk, and I'm doing this for NASA. There are things around us that are so natural and so curative that our bodies thrive for it. When I first tried some yellow birch sap that we tapped this spring, something said it was like it tasted medicinal. It was almost like my body was asking for that. And I think our bodies can tell us. You ever hear about kids, eating dirt because they need some kind of nutritious, the body yearns for that stuff. And I actually think that some of the things our children go through in schools in terms of anxieties is the body wanting proper nutrition. So I hope that the next time I come down here, there's a big circle and everyone gets to speak and tell us what they think we ought to do, because whether it's jobs, whether it's employment, whether it's the environment, or whether it's healthcare, there are wonderful ideas that each individual carry with it, and we need the input of everyone on it. But thank you for having me.
Thank you. And before I turn the time back over to Joan Toyer for some thank yous and concluding remarks, I just hope you'll indulge me for 1 second. Whether you heard the answers you wanted to tonight from the candidates, whether you support these candidates or some candidates who may not be here, please go out and vote. And after you've voted, please invite a friend to vote. The health of our democracy depends on it. Thank you so much. And Joan?
I want to give thanks to Eric for moderating today's forum and North Central Technical College for hosting, our candidates who spent time to learn about important health issues that impact not only our health, our safety, and our prosperity here in Marathon County. To Healthy Marathon County Board for sponsoring this event, and to my colleagues at Marathon County Health Department who were behind the scenes and coordinating this event. The issues we face are complex and requires collective community action and public policy. As health officer for Marathon County, I'm confident in our ability to focus on what matters, to change our family experiences and stories, to make the differences in our communities. In good health, enjoy your evening. Thank you.